Imagine for a moment, you're standing at the edge of a vast, quiet field just before dawn. The night behind you has not been kind. It's been heavy with doubt, storm, and silence. But in this stillness, just before the sun breaks, you feel it. Not relief, not joy, something else. Readiness. Not because the pain is gone, but because you are no longer hiding from it. As Emmet once taught, the outer world is not the final authority your inner life is. The fire you fear is often the very thing that was sent to wake you. So before we journey inward, I invite you to like and subscribe, but only if it truly resonates with your soul. Now breathe steady and keep walking. Because the truth is this: adversity is not your enemy. It never has been. What looks like a blow from the world is often a disguised invitation from your deeper self. Life, in its most profound intelligence, rarely whispers in still waters. It roars in disruption. It rattles the walls so your attention turns inward. That rumble in your life right now? It's not punishment. It's the knock of transformation. The idea that pain means something is wrong, that's a cultural myth, not a spiritual truth. Pain often means you're being sharpened. It means that what was too soft, too small, too false is being scorched away. That heat you feel, that's your old self cracking. You've likely been taught to chase calm, to seek ease, to avoid friction. But fire doesn't operate on comfort, it operates on truth. And the truth is, every worthy becoming is born in pressure. You may not see it now, but somewhere in this chaos, something is awakening. You are awakening. And awakening never feels peaceful at first. It feels like burning, not because you're dying, but because your illusions are. The parts of you that played small, that waited for permission, that tried to earn love through shrinking, they don't belong in the next chapter and they know it. But hear this clearly. The fire didn't come to destroy you. It came to reveal you, to call up the part of you that's been buried beneath roles, reactions, and routines. The self you've glimpsed in moments of boldness, but buried again when life got hard. That self doesn't need more time, it needs pressure, friction, adversity. That's where it emerges. The mind will scream for a way out, but the soul will whisper, walk in. Because you were never meant to dodge the fire, you were meant to stand in it, feel its heat, and let it strip away every layer that isn't you. Right now you might feel lost, worn, even broken. But what if this exact moment, the part you resent, the thing you dread, is the hinge of your becoming? What if this is the doorway through which you no longer pretend? Let me be clear. This isn't about glorifying pain or suffering. It's about seeing it for what it actually is. A message, not a verdict. A call, not a curse. Because you are not the wound. You are the one who will rise from it with cleaner vision, stronger roots, and a voice that finally speaks without apology. And no, the fire doesn't ask for your permission, but it will always honor your participation. The moment you stop running and face it not with fear, but with fierce willingness, it begins to change. It becomes your teacher, and then your ally. Look back at the moments that shaped you most. I'm willing to bet they weren't easy. They weren't calm. They were rough, uncertain, and overwhelming. And yet here you are, not despite those moments, but because of them. The same will be true for what you're facing now. Somewhere inside the storm is a spark, a truth waiting to be seen, a strength you didn't know you had. And that's the fire. Hidden, yes, but not absent. Patient, but never passive. It's there, waiting to be recognized. So if your world is cracking, let it. Let the surface shatter. Let the old scaffolding fall. Because what's underneath is not ruin. It's radiance. And the first flicker of it begins here, with your willingness to meet this fire not as a victim, but as a participant in your own transformation. The fire hidden behind adversity is not some poetic metaphor. It is the realest force working in your favor, whether you believe it yet or not. So walk with me, not around the flames, but into them. Because what's coming next will not break you. It will build you. And the ashes will not bury you. They will clear the ground for something truer than you've ever known. You didn't land here by accident. The very challenges that brought you to this moment, the ones you might still be resisting, are part of a thread pulling you inward. What appears on the surface to be setback or collapse is rarely the whole story. Often, it's a veil, a thin outer shell hiding a deeper unfolding. And when life seems to take things away, it's often clearing space for something far more aligned than you would have chosen on your own. You've been trained to interpret difficulty as failure. Most people have. Conditioned to believe that if things aren't going smoothly, something must be wrong. That idea is not just limiting, it's destructive. Because it keeps you looking outward for validation, for signs that you're on the right path, as if the path must always look safe and logical from the outside. But spiritual truth doesn't work that way. Growth is often cloaked in discomfort. Real clarity rarely announces itself with celebration, it sneaks in through unraveling. There comes a point in every transformation when the outer world no longer makes sense. The job no longer fits. The relationships feel distant. The schedule you used to manage now feels like noise. That moment can feel like loss, but it's actually precision. It's the part where life begins to strip away anything that isn't essential to who you're becoming. And if you cling too tightly to the old structure, you miss the invitation entirely. This is what Emmet understood, that outer conditions are never the cause, they are effects. Shadows cast by inner patterns, invisible beliefs, unconscious fears. And when those internal structures begin to shift, the outer world must reflect the change, sometimes through silence, sometimes through collapse, often through fire. The mistake is thinking that the fire is the origin, but the fire is only the messenger. Adversity often comes disguised as bad luck or cosmic unfairness. But look deeper. Many of the most profound breakthroughs come not when everything is working, but when nothing seems to be. That's the veil. The part of life that looks chaotic on the surface, but is deeply organized beneath. Like a seed splitting open in the dark, there's a hidden architecture to your struggle, an intelligent unfolding you don't need to control. But that doesn't mean it's easy. There's a violence to clarity. When illusions fall away, so do the comforts that kept you numb. When a role breaks down, so does the identity built around it. And without the familiar mirrors, the truth becomes sharp. This is the moment that tests you, not to destroy, but to strip, to reveal what's underneath once the noise fades. You may want to retreat to patch things up quickly, to return to normal. But normal was never your home. It was the mask. And the longer you fight for it, the more painful the fire becomes. Because it's not just trying to remove circumstances, it's trying to remove the false self that created them. So what do you do when the veil is tearing, when the comforts are crumbling, when the old you is slipping away and the new one hasn't yet arrived? You stand still, not in surrender to defeat, but in full presence. You stop searching for rescue and begin listening, not with your ears, but with your being. Because behind the noise of the collapsing outer world is a whisper, one that's been trying to reach you all along. This whisper doesn't shout for attention. It doesn't promise quick fixes. It doesn't feed the ego with affirmation. It speaks only when you've burned enough to become quiet. And when you hear it, really hear it, it changes everything. The adversity you face is not the final word. It's the tearing of the veil, the undoing of surface meaning, the break in logic that forces you to look inward, not for escape, but for origin. And once you begin seeing through that veil, the narrative shifts. You stop asking, "Why is this happening to me?" and begin asking, "What is this burning away that I no longer need?" That shift is everything. Because in that shift, you stop seeing life as an opponent and start seeing it as a mirror. You stop begging the world to change and start shaping meaning from within. The outer situation may not resolve right away. It may stay messy, unclear, uncertain, but something within you will have moved. And that movement, however small, is the spark of a new authority. It's easy to admire clarity once the storm has passed. But spiritual maturity is forged when you choose to trust that the storm itself has purpose. Not just in hindsight, but now, right here, in the thick of it. This is where your power is reclaimed. Not when life is perfect, but when you realize you are not at the mercy of appearances. The veil was never real, it was projection. The fire reveals it, not to shame you, but to set you free. So if everything around you seems to be breaking down, don't rush to rebuild. Look through. Listen deeper. The breakdown is a signal not to panic, but to awaken. What looks like the end is often the first clear view of who you really are beneath the veil. And once you see through it, you cannot go back. Not because you shouldn't, but because the soul refuses to pretend anymore. There's a moment, often overlooked, when the outer world begins to lose its grip, not because it's changed, but because something within you has stirred. It usually begins quietly. You don't announce it. You don't even realize it at first. But one day, amidst the confusion and noise, you stop reacting the way you used to. And that's when the fire begins to rise, not around you, but within. Transformation rarely starts with a choice. It starts with friction. The gentle friction of truth rubbing against illusion, until the heat is too loud to ignore. What once soothed you no longer satisfies. The roles you played now feel tight, unnatural. The stories you told yourself about who you are, what you deserve, what life is begin to fall apart in your hands. And that's where the furnace ignites. Not in joy, not in certainty, but in the trembling moment where the surface splits and the truth beneath begins to breathe. There's a reason you feel unsteady during times of real change. It's because the self you've known is melting. The identity built on past conditions, external approval, and old narratives can't withstand the intensity of awakening. It's not just your situation shifting, it's your center. Your point of orientation moves from outside in to inside out. And that change is disorienting at first, even frightening. But it's also the beginning of freedom. You may want to cling to what you've known. Most do. But the furnace does not accept half versions of you. It requires full presence. It demands that you come into the fire with nothing but your willingness to be reshaped. Not rebuilt according to old designs, but reformed from the inside by the truth of who you really are. This is not the time to escape into philosophy or abstract metaphors. This is where you meet your rawness, the ache, the doubt, the trembling hands. All of it becomes sacred. Not because it feels good, but because it's real. Because it's yours. Because it is through this burning that your next self is born. Think of the times in your life when you felt closest to truth. They weren't wrapped in comfort. They were lit by urgency, by collapse, by fire. Not the fire that destroys for no reason, but the fire that consumes illusion and leaves behind clarity. And clarity is not soft. It doesn't soothe, it slices. Through lies, through projections, through self-pity. It doesn't ask for your consent. It arrives as heat and asks only one thing. Will you stay here long enough to be changed? That's the breaking point for many where they try to run. Back to old habits, back to familiar distractions. But every escape only delays the inevitable. Because once the fire starts within you, it won't go out. It will follow you, press against your spine, whisper through your nights, until you return and face it. This is the rise, the moment the old frame cracks, and something deeper begins to surge. But the rise cannot continue indefinitely. It must sink, not in defeat, but in surrender. The fire asks not only for courage, but for trust, for the letting go of your timeline, your logic, your need to control how and when it all resolves. That sinking is humbling. It strips you not just of illusion, but of ego. You stop fighting for appearances. You stop performing strength. You sit in the ash, and for the first time you feel clean. And then comes the break. Not the breaking of you, but the breaking open. The point where resistance no longer serves, and you stop trying to be the version of yourself that everyone understood. You no longer need to be admired. You no longer chase reassurance. You become willing to walk into the unknown, not because it's safe, but because it's real. That's the inner furnace. Not a metaphor, not a concept, but a living reality burning behind your confusion. It is not here to punish. It is here to purify. And you do not come through it unchanged. But here's the truth. Once that fire begins within you, once you feel it burn through your fear and your falsehoods, you won't want to go back. Not because it's easy, but because it's yours. Because you finally belong to yourself. This furnace, painful as it may seem, is the birthplace of your clarity, your voice, your inner compass, and it's only just begun. The heat you feel now is not your undoing, it's your emergence. The shaping of a self that no longer waits for life to hand you peace, but knows how to claim it from within. And that knowing, however fragile at first, is the flame you will carry forward. There's a moment in every storm when the noise outside reaches a peak, and then, just beyond it, something inside begins to steady. It doesn't come from control. It doesn't come from knowing how things will turn out. It arrives when the panic runs out of breath, and silence finally has room to speak. This is when you begin to sense that, even amid the chaos, you are not the chaos itself. The circumstances surrounding you might scream for attention, deadlines missed, relationships strained, expectations unmet. But somewhere underneath the swirl, there's a subtle distinction. You are the one witnessing it all, not detached or numb, but aware. And this awareness, once recognized, becomes a turning point. When Emmet spoke of the spiritual life, he didn't describe some floating escape from the world. He pointed to something anchored, something that stands still, even when everything else moves. That anchor isn't found in a title or role. It's not your job, your history, or the opinions that once defined your identity. It's the quiet space behind your reactions, behind the mental noise that says, "This is too much," or "You can't handle this." That space doesn't argue. It observes. And from that observation comes power. You don't have to pretend that what's happening is pleasant. This isn't about sugarcoating hardship or turning pain into performance. But when you stop equating your worth with the weight of your problems, something shifts. You begin to move from reactivity to presence, from identification to sovereignty. The storm may still rage, but it no longer gets to define who you are. That distinction doesn't come through wishful thinking. It's earned in the trenches when you realize that the fear, the anger, the disappointment, no matter how overwhelming, are passing states. They do not speak the whole truth of you. They pass through your awareness, but they are not the awareness itself. And that awareness? It's not fragile. It does not need proof. It doesn't disappear when things go wrong. In fact, it often sharpens when conditions fall apart. Because the illusion that you were ever in control begins to dissolve, and what's left is something more honest, more stable than control could ever offer: clarity. You might still feel the sting of injustice, the uncertainty of an unclear path. But the moment you stop demanding that circumstances validate your peace, you reclaim your authority. Not the false kind built on outcomes, but the deeper kind that can stand in the center of the storm and remain whole. This isn't about detachment, it's about reorientation. You stop being the character caught in the plot twist and start becoming the author again. The pen returns to your hand not because the chaos ends, but because you no longer see yourself as powerless within it. There's immense dignity in this kind of presence. You don't need applause. You don't even need resolution. You simply choose to stand, not in defiance of reality, but in deep relationship with it. You face what is, and in doing so, you remember what cannot be touched. The adversity remains, but your identification with it begins to dissolve. That shift is subtle but seismic. You stop trying to outrun the storm and begin learning how to walk through it upright, clear-eyed, unshaken in your inner truth. You were never meant to become the storm. You were meant to see through it. That seeing doesn't mean you stop feeling. It means you stop drowning. You let the emotions come and go, but they no longer steer the wheel. You let the world do what the world does, but you begin responding from a place deeper than the world's influence. And from that place, something new begins to emerge. You find yourself choosing differently not because the pressure disappeared, but because you are no longer making decisions from fear. You start speaking more truthfully not because everyone will understand, but because you're no longer willing to be silent just to stay safe. The strength that begins to form here isn't flashy. It doesn't announce itself. It settles deep in your spine and steadies your breath. It tells you, this is not the end. When the fire first appeared, it felt like it came to take everything. Now, you begin to see that it came to give something. A new center, a deeper alignment. A perspective that can hold pain without losing itself to it. This is how you begin to walk forward, not out of the storm, but through it, with a steady step, with less panic and more presence. Not because life is suddenly fair, but because you have remembered what you are beyond circumstance. And as you carry that truth into what comes next, the fire continues its work not to consume but to clarify. Somewhere in your life, you've likely been taught that pain is random, that hardship is either a punishment or a senseless accident. But look more closely, and you'll start to notice a different pattern, one that doesn't fit the logic of chance, but reveals the presence of something more precise, more deliberate. Every turning point you've lived through had an intelligence behind it, not one crafted by the ego, but by something far more refined, universal law. This is where many flinch. The mind wants to believe that adversity is an error, a glitch in the system. But once you begin to understand the nature of spiritual law, you stop asking, "Why me?" and start asking, "What is this law showing me?" That shift doesn't remove the heat, but it gives it meaning. Universal law doesn't punish. It reflects, it aligns, it brings into form the energetic patterns you hold most consistently. Not your passing thoughts, but your deeply rooted assumptions about life, about love, about yourself. When those assumptions are out of sync with truth, friction arises, not as cruelty, but as correction. The fire shows up not to burn you for your flaws, but to bring the unconscious to light. This can feel confronting at first. The ego would rather blame fate, people, or systems. It takes courage to pause in the midst of struggle and say, "What is this mirroring back to me?" Not because you're the cause of everything, but because you're never separate from the pattern. Your vibration participates in the outcome, even when the details are beyond your control. That's what Emmet pointed toward when he emphasized that your inner state is the true creative force. Outer results are never independent. They are shaped, day by day, by the quality of your consciousness. And when your consciousness shifts, the law responds. Not always instantly, but always faithfully. This is why spiritual maturity demands responsibility, not the kind that shames you for suffering, but the kind that empowers you to decode it. You begin to recognize that pain is information, resistance is a signal, and the fire itself is feedback not just from life, but from the very law that governs life. And that law is consistent. It cannot be manipulated, bypassed, or appeased. It doesn't respond to performance, it responds to essence. So if you're trying to speak one truth while embodying another, the law will expose the gap. Not to embarrass you, to refine you, to invite you into congruence. This is the point where many turn away. They want miracles without accountability, change without disruption. But transformation doesn't work that way. It asks for coherence. The law will never deliver to you something you are not aligned to receive. So if your outer life is burning, ask not only what's being removed, but what's being revealed about the pattern beneath. There's no shame in seeing the misalignment. In fact, that's where the breakthrough begins. You realize you're not at the mercy of chaos. You're in relationship with a system so intelligent, it will burn away anything that contradicts your truest intention, even if that intention has not yet reached your conscious mind. The moment you stop viewing adversity as a failure and start seeing it as calibration, everything changes. You no longer fight the fire. You work with it. You allow it to surface the belief systems that no longer serve you. You welcome the discomfort as the signal that something outdated is losing its hold. That's when the flame becomes less frightening. You don't enjoy it, but you respect it. You understand that the pain is not personal, it's precise. And the more you align with that precision, the less you need the fire to scream for your attention. This is not the same as perfection. Alignment isn't a performance, it's a posture. It's the willingness to become more honest with yourself, more attuned to your inner vibration, more responsible for what you're broadcasting into the law. You begin to clean your frequency, not out of fear, but out of devotion. And slowly, the fire that once felt like punishment begins to feel like partnership. It burns through falsehood, yes, but it also ignites truth. It strips away, but it also reveals. It dismantles, but it also rebuilds with materials far stronger than the ones you clung to before. And in that rebuilding, you stop asking for the world to approve of your becoming. You begin to trust the intelligence of the law itself, knowing that every piece of your growth, every challenge, every delay, every fire was part of something far more exact than chaos could ever produce. If you look closely at your life, you'll notice something curious. The most profound changes didn't happen when everything was going well. They happened when you had no choice but to face yourself. When the scaffolding of comfort collapsed and the familiar tools no longer worked. It was in those moments raw, uninvited, undeniable, that something within you stirred. That stirring was the beginning of a shift, and at the heart of that shift was fire. Not the fire of destruction, but the fire of transmutation. Pain often carries a strange reverence. It arrives with a silence that clears the noise, demanding your full attention. But pain in itself is not sacred. Pain becomes sacred only when you allow it to become fuel. Not every bruise teaches. Not every wound transforms. But the ones you look at directly, the ones you feel all the way through, those are the ones that refine. There's a danger in romanticizing suffering. Many confuse endurance with growth. But pain is not inherently noble. It is neutral until you engage it with consciousness. Until you choose to use it not as identity, but as ignition. That is where the alchemy begins. When you stop asking, "Why is this happening to me?" and begin asking, "What can I build with this?" That shift moves you from survival to authorship. It's not an easy move. Most people stay stuck, not because the pain is too great, but because the permission to rise hasn't come from within. They wait for a sign, a savior, a certainty. But what transforms suffering into power isn't the promise of a better outcome, it's the decision to extract meaning from what already is. You stop waiting for conditions to improve, and start forging strength inside the moment itself. Emmet often spoke of mental equivalency, the truth that what you hold in mind will shape the conditions of your life. That teaching isn't just about visualization or positive thinking, it's about ownership. It's about recognizing that your inner state is the raw material from which every future moment will form. And when pain enters that space, it becomes a potent ingredient if you're willing to shape it rather than shrink from it. This doesn't mean pretending you're fine. It means letting the pain become information, letting the ache show you where your boundaries were unclear, where your voice was silenced, where your energy was spent in places unworthy of your investment. These insights are not luxuries, they're the foundation of your next becoming. And becoming is always a process of fire. You won't emerge instantly. There will be moments when the weight feels unbearable, when the tears come without warning, when you doubt whether any of this is worth it. In those moments, the temptation is to numb, to run, to rationalize. But if you stay just a little longer, something will begin to turn. The pain, no longer rejected, begins to burn cleaner. It becomes a teacher instead of a tormentor. This is the sink, the descent into honesty, into the places within you that ache for acknowledgement, the ones you pushed aside to keep the peace, to hold it together, to seem strong. But strength that relies on suppression is hollow. True power emerges when you meet yourself in the depths and stop demanding perfection before allowing healing. And then, quietly, the break begins. Not the kind that shatters, but the kind that softens. A release, a moment where you exhale without needing all the answers. Where you let go, not because everything's fixed, but because holding on has become heavier than the unknown. That letting go is not a defeat, it's a rite of passage. You begin to speak differently. Not from pain, but from wisdom. You listen more. You rush less. You no longer measure your worth by how well you perform resilience. Instead, you begin to honor the fire for what it gave you, the ability to transform pain into presence and presence into power. And as you walk forward, the outer world may not yet reflect your new alignment. There may still be mess, misunderstanding, delay. But something unshakable has changed. You're no longer looking outward for proof of progress. You feel the change in your posture, your pace, your presence. You carry your fire with a steadiness that cannot be faked. Because now, the pain that once felt like an enemy has become the very force that forged your voice. There's a particular exhaustion that comes not from the trial itself, but from the refusal to meet it. Resistance consumes more energy than grief. It is the endless cycle of asking why, of clinging to old narratives, of bargaining with what already is. You may not notice it at first. It disguises itself as control, as productivity, even as strength. But beneath the surface, it drains you. You've likely experienced this firsthand. The moment when the situation is already on fire, yet a part of you insists on holding the matchbook, hoping that maybe if you try harder, explain more, fix it faster, it won't be real. That reflex to override reality, to postpone surrender by just one more effort, that's resistance. And it's not heroic, it's delay. What Emmet Fox understood, and what most avoid admitting, is that the longer you resist the lesson, the more intense the fire becomes. Life does not punish, but it insists. The signals get louder, not out of cruelty, but clarity. If a whisper doesn't reach you, life will raise its voice. And if the voice is ignored, life may set the stage ablaze not to harm, but to strip away every excuse. Resistance doesn't change the fire. It just keeps you standing outside it, shivering in fear, rehearsing arguments that never land. Meanwhile, the fire waits. It doesn't chase. It doesn't plead. It simply burns, faithfully doing what it's meant to do, purify. And only when you stop running does it begin to reveal what it was always trying to give you. This is the rise, the instant when something inside finally says, enough. Not in defeat, but in deep willingness. You stop demanding that life look like your plan. You stop performing for approval. You set down the armor, not because you've given up, but because you've finally given in to truth, to presence, to the work that only begins when resistance ends. In that moment, everything shifts. The fire you feared begins to soften. It doesn't stop burning, but now, it burns through what no longer serves. The lies, the striving, the unnecessary performances, the illusion that you have to carry it all alone. As that layer peels back, clarity begins to emerge, not as an answer, but as a quiet knowing. You are not here to avoid life. You are here to participate in its full unfolding. The sink comes soon after, not into despair, but into honesty. You begin to feel the weight of what you've been holding, how long you've tried to carry the uncarryable. How much of your energy went to keeping up appearances, proving you were okay, even when you weren't. That fall into honesty is not weakness. It's the start of release. And as the resistance dissolves, so does the noise. You don't need to argue anymore. You don't need to defend your pain or prove its legitimacy. You simply allow it. And in that allowing, a strange thing happens. The very thing you feared begins to feel like relief. Then comes the break. Not as a collapse, but as a soft rupture. A moment when you breathe without bracing. When you cry without apologizing. When you stop trying to explain your journey to those who were never meant to understand it. You no longer need to win a debate with the past. You are too busy inhabiting the present. This is where the fire finally finds its rhythm within you. No longer an outside force threatening to undo your world, but an inner force aligning it. It no longer burns indiscriminately, it burns with purpose. And you, now surrendered, begin to walk differently. You are not waiting for the pain to disappear, you are allowing it to do its work. From this place, you begin to make decisions not from fear or delay, but from clarity. You stop stalling your growth for the comfort of others. You stop pretending you're fine when you're not. You stop delaying your evolution out of nostalgia for identities you've already outgrown. You become less interested in defending the version of you that the fire came to end, and more devoted to the version emerging from its center. Because now, you're not resisting the burn. You are walking with it. Some things were never meant to last, not because they were mistakes, but because their season was temporary. We don't grieve them because they were wrong. We grieve them because they carried a purpose that's now complete. And the fire, ruthless in its accuracy, has a way of removing what no longer fits, even when you're still emotionally attached. The refining fire doesn't ask for your readiness. It moves on its own time, and when it arrives, it doesn't knock, it enters. What remains after it has passed through is not determined by your preferences, but by what is truly yours to carry forward. Everything else, roles, beliefs, relationships, even long-held ambitions are exposed. Not judged, simply revealed for what they are. Temporary containers for growth that has now outlived its shape. At first, this feels like loss. You may want to reach back, to gather the remnants, to rebuild the old structure just one more time. But what you're feeling isn't just grief, it's purification. The pain of letting go is not always proof that something should be held onto. Sometimes it's simply the cost of honesty. This is when the old identity resists the hardest. It wants to survive the fire. It makes you nostalgic for what was, even if what was kept you small. But there is no place for pretense in the refining process. The fire doesn't preserve what looks good. It preserves what's real. The truth is, some things needed to burn. The version of you that relied on being understood. The patterns that used survival as a lifestyle. The need to explain your boundaries. All of that was smoke. And the fire didn't destroy your essence, it revealed it by taking the rest. This is the rise where you begin to see that what fell away didn't diminish you. It clarified you. You're not less whole, you're less crowded. What's gone didn't define you, it distracted you. And now, with less to cling to, you start to feel a strength that isn't built on performance. But then comes the sink, an ache that lingers even in clarity. You see what's been stripped away, and even if you understand it had to go, you still feel the absence. There's a humility in standing in that space. A sobering quiet where there used to be noise. You realize how much of your energy went to maintaining the unnecessary. And without it, you feel both free and exposed. This space isn't to be rushed. It's not an empty hallway to sprint through. It's a chamber where new sight is formed, where you begin to notice what survived, what remained untouched, what the fire, in all its intelligence, chose to preserve. Those remnants are not small, they are gold. The loyalty that didn't depend on agreement, the faith that didn't crumble in silence, the truth that stayed steady even when no one affirmed it. These are not just fragments, they are your foundation. Then, slowly, comes the break, not a collapse, but a realization. You no longer want what you lost, not really. You wanted what it once meant, but meaning evolves. And now, you are choosing presence over memory, clarity over comfort. The fire did not take anything you still need. It removed what was ready to go. And this doesn't mean the grief is gone. It means the grief is integrated. It has moved from chaos into wisdom, from ache into alignment. You stop chasing what's already ash. You stop mourning what was never yours to keep. And you start tending to what remains. This is how the fire refines, not through punishment but precision. What stays is sacred. What burns was never built to last. And you begin to rise, not with more, but with less, lighter, clearer, truer than you've ever been. Once the dust settles and the initial burn fades, there comes a moment when the outer world still looks scorched, yet something inside you begins to see differently. You begin to realize that what's visible, the situation, the loss, the circumstance, is only a fraction of the truth. Beneath it all, behind the ashes and the silence, is a deeper design unfolding, invisible but exact. It's natural to focus on what's gone. The human mind searches for patterns, for meaning it can grasp with the senses. And when something collapses, whether a dream, a relationship, a belief, it's easy to mistake the ruin for failure. But that surface reality is only the echo. The true message lies underneath, in the deeper structure you're only just beginning to perceive. This is where spiritual vision sharpens, not through hope, but through stillness. When you no longer need to fix, perform, or flee, your perception opens. Not outward, but inward. And in that inward seeing, the pain that once felt random begins to feel intentional. Not because you deserved it, but because life, in its sacred architecture, is always working in alignment with your inner evolution. Emmet Fox often taught that outer events are symbolic expressions of an inner state made visible. But he wasn't suggesting we blame ourselves for pain. He was inviting us to look through it, to recognize that every collapse might be a doorway, every delay a redirection, every silence a preparation for clarity that words can't deliver. This is the rise, the emergence of deeper seeing. You stop asking life to make sense on your terms and begin asking to see what's been hidden by your assumptions. You notice how much of your suffering came not from the situation, but from the meaning you attached to it. That shift is everything. And yet, this new sight doesn't remove the ache. It deepens it. That's the sink. You realize that clarity isn't always comforting. Sometimes it reveals that you've outgrown more than you expected, that certain relationships were built on your willingness to stay small, that your old life was aligned to an older version of you, and that version no longer exists. This clarity can feel lonely, because seeing through illusions often means walking away from the systems and stories that once felt like home. But that ache, that holy ache, is part of your rebirth. You are not just recovering from loss. You are adjusting to vision. And then comes the break, not as devastation, but as decision. You begin to live from this new sight, even when it hasn't yet materialized in form. You stop negotiating with the old world, hoping it will validate your growth. You walk forward without applause, because your knowing is now enough. You no longer argue with what left. You no longer need every answer. You live as one who is seen behind the shell. And that seeing stays with you. It sharpens your choices, softens your judgments, and roots your actions in something more grounded than before. Now, even the fire itself begins to look different. It was never just an end, it was a clearing. It burned away what kept you blind. And in that space, new meaning begins to rise, not as an epiphany, but as a way of being, a calm that does not deny pain, but contains it, a strength that is not loud but immovable. You may still carry questions, but now you know where to look for answers, not in the noise of opinion, not in the surface drama, but in the quiet architecture beneath it all. And from that place you begin to live differently, not because everything is resolved, but because you've seen the pattern behind the burn. What once felt like destruction now feels like direction. And even if the path is unclear, your presence within it is no longer lost. There comes a point in the process when the outer situation remains unresolved, yet you begin to notice a subtle shift. Your internal landscape is no longer controlled by it. The emotions still come, but they don't dictate your choices. The circumstances still speak, but their voice has lost its authority. You're not suppressing how you feel, you're relating to it differently. This is where true power returns. Up until now, you may have believed that transformation meant eliminating fear, doubt, or grief. But those emotions aren't the problem. It's the belief that they must disappear before you can move forward that keeps you bound. Authority over emotion doesn't mean denial, it means you no longer confuse feeling with truth. You begin to see that just because a thought arises doesn't make it a prophecy. Just because an old wound stings doesn't mean it defines you. Your reactions no longer get to run the show. You observe them, understand them, even honor them, but you don't obey them. This is the quiet pivot where strength matures, not into defiance, but into discernment. The fire helped burn through the confusion. But now, in the afterglow, the real task begins. Choosing your interpretation. That's where your creative power lives. Not in changing facts, but in shaping the meaning you assign to them. You start asking not, "What happened to me?" but "What meaning do I choose to live from now?" This is the rise when you realize that your narrative is yours to shape, no matter what was said, done, or withheld. The story others told about you no longer holds power. Even the one you told yourself begins to loosen. You begin to rewrite, not through fantasy, but through clarity. But then comes the sink, that humbling drop into reality. You still feel the triggers, the body remembers, the mind wanders. There are days when you forget everything you've learned and find yourself back in the same old spiral. That doesn't mean you've failed. It means you're human. And in that humanity, the fire continues its work not to scorch, but to integrate. You stop expecting perfection as proof of progress. You begin to see that mastery is not the absence of struggle, but the presence of deeper awareness within it. You no longer expect to be untouchable. You learn how to be resilient without being hardened, flexible without collapsing, present without drowning. This is where the break arrives, not as a breakdown, but as a break from the old contract, the one that said you must be led by fear, that you must earn your worth, that your emotions are stronger than your spirit. You break from the need to control everything around you and anchor yourself in the one place you do have sovereignty, your interpretation. And that interpretation becomes a shield, not to block life out, but to move through it with dignity. You begin to speak from a deeper place. You listen differently. You stop arguing with people who haven't earned access to your energy. You become deliberate, not because you're guarded, but because you've learned the cost of leaking your peace for the sake of being understood. Emmet Fox often emphasized that thought is the root of all experience. But behind thought is interpretation, and interpretation is a choice. Once you begin choosing from presence rather than programming, the fire no longer has to roar. It begins to simmer, to refine quietly, to empower subtly. It doesn't need to tear your life down anymore. You're now aligned enough to hear its whisper. And from that place, the outer world begins to respond. Not because you manipulated it, but because your signal has changed. The law responds not to what you say, but to what you are. And what you are now is not defined by your history. It's shaped by your capacity to remain centered in truth, even when appearances tempt you to forget. Authority over emotion is not control, it's relationship. It's the ability to feel everything without letting anything steal your compass. And that compass, once reclaimed, turns you from a reactor into a creator. The fire no longer needs to drag you through transformation. Now, it walks beside you. By now, the fire has done what it came to do. It's silenced the outer clamor and peeled away the urgency that once kept you on edge. You're no longer chasing immediate answers, no longer waiting for the world to hand you clarity. What emerges instead is something far more enduring, a voice, not new, but long, buried. One that doesn't demand attention, yet holds a presence so steady it cannot be ignored. It's easy to miss at first. After all, you've been conditioned to listen to everything else: expectation, fear, old programming. This voice doesn't fight them. It simply waits for you to get quiet enough to hear it. It isn't flashy. It doesn't speak in thunder. Its language is subtle yet unmistakable, an inner knowing that feels more like remembering than learning. As you listen, something begins to rise. Not confidence in the conventional sense, but a kind of inner recognition. You don't feel bigger than life, you feel aligned with it. And that alignment is not loud. It's composed. The fire didn't create this voice, it cleared the static that kept it hidden. What's speaking now is the core of you that was never confused, never panicked, never unsure. Then comes the ache. You remember all the times this voice tried to speak, and you silenced it. Not out of neglect, but necessity. You had to survive. You followed the rules of a world that rewarded performance, not presence. And now, as you begin to reconnect with this truer guide, there's a sting not because you failed, but because you abandoned something sacred without even realizing it. This is the sink. You begin to feel the weight of the gap between who you were and who you're returning to. It humbles you. But in that humility, the voice gets clearer. It doesn't condemn. It doesn't revisit the past with judgment. It simply offers you a way forward. Not through perfection, but through deeper honesty. And then the break. Not a rupture, but a threshold. You no longer lean on external validation before making your next move. That compulsion to explain your path to people who never truly saw you begins to fade. Choices are made more quietly now, not because you're hiding, but because there's no need to announce what already feels true inside. You move differently. There's less asking for permission and more following inner alignment. The opinions that once had power begin to lose their weight, not because they changed, but because you've changed where you listen from. Discernment replaces urgency. Integrity replaces people-pleasing. Presence replaces performance. Emmet Fox often reminded us that the divine voice is always there. It's our listening that wanders. But now, you've returned. Not as a seeker hoping for direction, but as someone who has remembered how to hear. This isn't about becoming a different person. It's about removing what was never really you to begin with. And the voice that remains, it doesn't need to be convinced. It already knows where you're going. By now, the fire is no longer something outside you. It's not an event, not a chapter to survive or recover from. It has become a presence that walks with you not to destroy, but to illuminate. The intensity may have eased, but its imprint remains. It lives in your breath, your posture, your decisions. You've carried it with you not as a scar, but as a source of light from within. You don't think of adversity the same way anymore. It's no longer just something to overcome, it's part of the terrain you've learned to navigate. Each step you take carries the residue of what's been burned away and the clarity of what was uncovered. And in that clarity, a new rhythm begins to form. You move more deliberately now, not because you're cautious, but because your compass has been recalibrated. This is where the walking begins, not away from the fire, but with it. It joins you like a quiet companion, not constantly speaking, but always present. It doesn't interrupt your day, it sharpens your awareness. It doesn't shout direction, but it ensures that the steps you take are not dictated by fear or performance. It becomes part of your decision-making, not through noise, but through discernment. You begin to feel the strength that lives in sustained presence. It's not the adrenaline of crisis anymore. It's steadiness. There's less flinching, less anticipation of collapse. Even when tension appears, you meet it differently. Because you've walked through worse. Because you've learned that fire, when embraced, refines more than it removes. This is the rise, the return to the world with new weight in your step. Not heavy, but anchored. You're no longer seeking permission to evolve. You're no longer waiting for the world to mirror your progress. The fire you walked through has already affirmed it. You know what you've survived, what you've surrendered, what you've reclaimed. But with that return comes a quiet reckoning the sink. You start to realize that not everyone will understand this new version of you. You may find yourself outgrowing conversations, outpacing old dynamics, speaking truths that fall flat in rooms where surface-level comfort is still king. And there's grief in that. Not loud, not desperate, just a soft ache that rises when your pace no longer matches the places you used to call home. It's tempting to shrink again, to soften your tone, to hold back your clarity so others feel safe. But you remember what that costs. Not in theory and memory. You know what it feels like to abandon yourself. You remember how the fire began in the first place, not with catastrophe, but with the subtle erosion of authenticity, and you won't go back. Then, without ceremony, comes the break. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. One day, you speak a truth without fear. You leave a space that no longer honors your presence. You decline an invitation to perform, and you feel no guilt, not because you're hardened, but because you've integrated the fire. You no longer react from the wounds, it's the wisdom that now moves your feet. You realize that walking with the fire means living in ongoing refinement. You don't seek comfort at all costs. You seek alignment, even when it brings friction. You don't strive to be untouched by challenge, you've become someone who moves through it awake. This isn't about stoicism, it's about sovereignty. You no longer confuse peace with silence. You recognize that sometimes the most sacred thing you can do is disrupt an old pattern. And that disruption doesn't have to be loud. Sometimes it's just a steady refusal to betray yourself again. You carry the fire differently now. It doesn't rage, it resides. It no longer burns you, it burns through you. It keeps you honest. It keeps you clear. And when the next trial comes, as life guarantees it will, you won't need to brace or beg or bargain. You'll stand in it, not as someone waiting to survive, but as someone who has already been through the burn and come out truer. At a certain point in the process, the fire stops consuming and begins revealing. What remains in your hands is not the heat, but the residue, the ash of what once was. It gathers quietly, in your thoughts, in your memory, in the habits that linger even after the shift. And it's here, standing among these remnants, that a new challenge arises, not the struggle of enduring adversity, but the invitation to release what it has already taken. There's a strange comfort in what's familiar, even when the familiar has outlived its truth. You may find yourself reaching for what already burned. Old beliefs, old roles, old explanations for who you are. Not because they still fit, but because they once gave you structure. Even if the fire has removed them, the impulse to return remains. And that impulse is not weakness, it's grief in disguise. This is where many stall. They confuse survival with revival. They think letting go means forgetting, or that acceptance means pretending it didn't matter. But honoring what burned is not the same as carrying its ashes into your future. There comes a moment when you must look at what no longer lives, bless it for what it taught you, and place it down. That's the rise, not a dramatic epiphany, but a quiet willingness to stop rehearsing what was lost. You stop trying to explain it. You stop using it to justify your hesitation. You begin to recognize that freedom isn't found in collecting new tools, it's in releasing the outdated ones still taking up space within you. But letting go doesn't happen in a single act. It happens in waves. This is the sink. You'll feel the pull, the instinct to retell the old story, to justify the version of you that suffered, to defend the wounds as if they are your resume. And sometimes, without realizing it, you'll slip back into that identity. Not because you're weak, but because memory is strong. What makes this moment sacred isn't that you never look back. It's that when you do, you no longer confuse those ashes for truth. You begin to see them as markers, not maps. They are evidence of where you've been, not blueprints for where you're going. Then comes the break, the gentle severing of emotional ties to what already fell away. You begin to trust the present version of yourself more than the one who walked through the fire. Not because that earlier self was wrong, but because they brought you here. You honor them by not dragging their struggle into your next chapter. There's dignity in this kind of closure. It doesn't require fanfare. It's not about getting rid of the past, it's about refusing to let it define your future. You no longer shape your identity around what you've endured. You shape it around what you're now capable of becoming. Emmet would remind us that spiritual evolution isn't about clinging to outcomes. It's about alignment with principle. The principle here is trust, that what burned was meant to, that what remains is enough, that your becoming doesn't need to be carried in pieces, only in presence. You begin to walk lighter, not because there's no pain, but because you've stopped packing it into every bag you carry. Conversations shift, choices simplify. Not every decision requires deep processing anymore. Some things are simply no longer relevant. They served their purpose and are now complete. Letting go of the ashes is not an act of forgetting. It is the highest form of integration. You don't bury the fire, you embody it. And in doing so, you open space for something new to arrive. Not just externally, but internally. Spaciousness returns, and with it, a new kind of peace. One that isn't bought with avoidance, but earned through the courage to release. And this peace, unlike anything you knew before, is quiet and steady. Because there is nothing left to prove. There's a stillness that follows the burn, not the silence of defeat, but the quiet of something more complete. The structures have fallen. The echoes of old patterns have faded. You're not racing to rebuild anymore, nor are you haunted by what collapsed. What's left now is a kind of presence that can't be forced, a groundedness that grows only from fire-won clarity. This is not about being unshakable. It's about being awake. There's a rawness that stays with you, but it doesn't weaken, it sharpens. You notice more how you speak, how you spend your time, where your energy lands and where it's being wasted. You're no longer chasing noise. You've come to understand the value of quiet, not as withdrawal, but as wisdom. The afterglow isn't dramatic, it's subtle, but it's real. It lives in your pauses, your posture, your decisions that no longer come from defense. It lives in your refusal to pretend, to shrink, to perform. It lives in the dignity of simply being steady, even when no one's watching. This is the rise not into elevation, but into embodiment. You've stopped waiting to become. You've arrived, not as a finished product, but as someone who no longer negotiates with truth. The fire didn't elevate you above your humanity, it returned you to it, fierce, tender, awake. Still, there's a softness in this space. That's the sink. You feel the gap between who you used to be and who you are now. You're not mourning, but you're aware. There are fewer words. More presence. You're not rushing to share your process anymore. Some things you've lived through are too sacred to package into story. They belong to the silence now, not because they're hidden, but because they've integrated so deeply they no longer need to be explained. People may notice the difference. Some may drift. Others may draw closer. But you're not adjusting yourself to manage their response. You're living from alignment, not from expectation. That shift didn't happen overnight. It came from walking through the fire long enough to trust your own center more than their opinions. Then comes the break not into chaos, but into choice. You begin choosing from a different frequency. You no longer act from urgency. There's no need to prove, to chase, to dramatize. You speak when it matters. You move when it's time. You trust the unfolding because you trust yourself within it. This isn't detachment. It's devotion to truth, to alignment, to a kind of peace that isn't conditional on outer agreement. You've stopped measuring progress by how much has changed outside. You measure it by how quietly grounded you remain inside, regardless of what the world is doing. Emmet wrote that divine power expresses through calm precision, not emotional noise. That's where you now live, not in the exhaustion of reaction, but in the clarity of response. Not in the theater of spiritual identity, but in the simplicity of being rooted. The afterglow doesn't ask you to shine, it asks you to carry. What you've earned, what you've learned, what you've become, it's in your bones now. You don't need to announce it, you simply are it. And being it is enough. Whatever comes next, it won't be met by the same version of you who first stepped into the fire. You no longer brace for impact. You walk forward with quiet power. There's a threshold at the far edge of transformation, a place beyond recovery, beyond clarity, where the fire is no longer something you pass through. It has become part of your being. It doesn't flicker in your memory. It burns quietly within your awareness, not as a reminder of pain, but as the source of everything solid that remains. You've become something else now, not an elevated version of the old self, not a polished survivor, but someone entirely different. You no longer hold your strength in tension or prove your wisdom with words. There is no more audience, no more stage. What moves you now is not performance, it's presence. Becoming the flame itself means the separation between you and the fire is gone. You've stopped talking about transformation and started living as its embodiment, not occasionally, not when conditions are right, but in every moment that asks you to show up with clarity and courage instead of shrinking back into fear. This is the rise, not as effort, but as essence. There's no push, there's no striving. You've come into rhythm with the very law that once felt like opposition. It moves through you now, your perception, your voice, your choices. It informs without needing to explain. It directs without needing to control. And yet, the human part of you remains. That's the sink. You still feel, still falter, still forget. But even in the forgetting, something deeper holds. The foundation doesn't crack the way it once did. You might wobble, but you no longer fracture. And this inner continuity is what you used to mistake for perfection. It's not that you've removed all error. It's that you've stopped making error your identity. The break comes quietly. Not a rupture, but a release. You begin to move through life without the constant reflex to protect or prove. You make room for truth without resistance, for change without panic, for uncertainty without paralysis. The old vocabulary of survival falls silent. You don't need it anymore. Now, there is only the fire you carry. It lives in how you speak, in what you no longer chase, in the way you meet silence without rushing to fill it. in the way you enter each moment, not guarded, but grounded. Emmet would say that true spiritual power reveals itself in consistency, and this consistency is not repetition, it's congruence. A life where what you believe and how you live are no longer two separate forces at odds with each other. They've become one. You don't need the storm to end. You no longer measure growth by the absence of conflict. You measure it by the quality of your response, the steadiness of your walk, the honesty in your presence. And when someone asks you what changed, you don't offer a lesson or a metaphor. You don't reach for clever language or glowing explanations. You simply say, I burned, and now I carry fire. Now that we've reached the end, you may notice that nothing around you has changed, and yet something inside you is no longer the same. The tension that followed you through each section has softened. The questions you once held with urgency feel quieter now, not because every answer has been given, but because you've become more comfortable standing inside the mystery. You walk through the flame not with bravado, not with blind hope, but with presence. And presence is the truest power there is. It doesn't erase difficulty, it doesn't guarantee a smooth path. But it gives you something stronger than certainty, a rootedness in yourself that no storm can take. Pause here, not to reflect in silence, but to feel the subtle shift in your own awareness. You're no longer asking what the fire was for. You understand now. It shaped you not by force, but by focus. It revealed what mattered and melted away everything that didn't test. You no longer carry the weight of proving your worth, because you've seen what remains after everything false falls away. As you move forward, let that clarity guide your decisions. Let it inform what you say yes to, what you release, where you rest. This isn't the end of your becoming, it's the integration of all that's been revealed. From here, the journey continues, not as a struggle, but as a deeper embodiment of truth. And on the days when the old patterns try to reappear, remember, you don't need to fight them. You've already walked through the flame. You've already made it through the undoing. You've earned the stillness you now feel. Carry it with grace, speak with intention, walk with steadiness. Because from now on, you are not someone looking for light. You are the fire,